Yes, Nuwan.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, America's Got Talent. Story for another time. Today, I'd like to talk about spatial music. Alternative title is Music in Space, but it has a slightly different ring to it than you might think. Spatial music, what do I mean by that? Well, every time we hear a piece of music, we are also attuned to the space in which it's being performed. If it's in the radio, then we're attuned to those speakers, but we use our imagination. But if you're at a concert, maybe you're at the Palace, maybe you're at someone's living room, whatever it is, it really conditions the way you hear the piece. All music is inherently spatial, I would say. We basically let it go unacknowledged, more or less. I want to address this. I think it's very interesting that we basically, music scholars have hardly said anything about the spatiality of music. We have this very well-defined theoretical framework for melody, harmony, and rhythm, and all kinds of aspects of music. Students are forced to take Theory 1, Theory 2, Theory 3, Theory 4, and all deals with these very specific things, but never once is the space in which music is performed addressed. All music is treated as exactly the same, no matter if it's performed, as I said, in your living room or in a grand cathedral. But obviously the experience is a little bit different, or very different, depending on what it is. So we're going to try to poke at this. First, what I'm going to do is launch into a discussion of pieces that need certain spaces. They don't work nearly as well if they're in just everybody's on a big clump on stage. So the big clump is basically your standard stage arrangement. Everybody is sort of all together. You get to look at them, and it's all very nice. What happens if we disrupt that a little bit? Sometimes composers ask for performers to be in various locations. Sometimes everybody just knows that it's supposed to be that way. The first really major composer in an era that used vastly different spaces was in Venice around the beginning of the Baroque era. Giovanni Gabrieli is the most famous one of these fellows, but of course there are hundreds of the Venetian polychoral composers. Polychoral means multiple choirs. Choirs back in that day meant it could have instruments, could have strings, brass, choir. It's just all called a choir if they're all together in one group. If you, hopefully, some of you have been in St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. Absolutely wonderful space. Giant place. You can see, I believe I used that for my flyer, is the picture. And there are all these galleries all over the place. There are maybe a dozen galleries or something like that. Now that flyer hardly does it justice because the galleries are recessed. As you walk around, you say, oh, there's another area where someone could be, and there's another area. And so this place, it's still that way today. It's been kept intact, from that time. And you can still see it in Venice as it slowly sinks into the sea, unfortunately. I think when I was in Venice, actually, it was under about 2 feet of water. They had wooden boards over there as Venice sinks. But at any rate, so go before the sea level rises too much, I guess. They have all kinds of galleries, and the thought is that Gabrieli wrote pieces for up to 8 different groups. And they would all have its own continuo section, and often they would all have its own organ. Now, these weren't giant organs, they're little continuo organs that you could pick up and move around, but it's still amazing to think that 8 organs could all be used in one performance. There's a lot of music like this. Now, it's passed down to us through history that, of course, there's a choir here, and they play for a little while, and there's a choir here, and they play for a little while, and then that one off the distance. That's just how we understand the space. But in the 1980s, a fellow named David Bryant released an article that said, no, I think that everybody's all grouped in a big clump in the middle of the performance space. And he had some very valid and interesting arguments for that. And then later people rebutted him, but it's still a contentious issue, whether or not the choir should be separated. And it's very interesting because the common knowledge is still that everybody is supposed to be separated. But it's a huge question. Now, what does that mean for performance? There are a few issues here. If the performers are closer together, then it's very easy for them to follow each other, just one conductor. Everybody can hear each other. If they're all in different galleries, the acoustic there is something like a 5-second reverb. So by the time you hear when you're supposed to come in, you're actually like 3 seconds behind or something like that. And it could just completely fall off the rails. So there are a couple interesting constraints on the music for this. That means one group is going to play for a while, the other group is just going to start together at a different time. But if all groups try to come in together and have the same rhythm, you're either going to have very slow harmonic changes so that everybody can kind of figure it out. And it looks like they did do it visually, with one guy kind of waving his hand across the galleries. Or you just try to avoid it altogether. Now, David Bryant's argument is that they're together so much of the time that it was impossible for them to be 100 feet apart. It just wouldn't have worked. It would have sounded cacophonous. They would be in totally different spots in the music. Other people say, well, they're good enough musicians, they can do it. So, and there are other scholarly things, such as a few paintings and things like that. But nonetheless, what we have today is that we have this conception as musicians, generally, that the polychoral style includes people from various galleries. So we have a reenactment at the Abbey Church of Moulins. And these are all, what I would often do in a presentation like this, the standard music presentation is I would show you a score right now, and you would imagine, but knowing that this is a humanities center presentation, I won't give you all this notation. I'm going to use some videos instead with the actual music, and the musicians among you can make out what the harmonies are doing. So here is, hopefully, all right, we will reload. Server not found. That's exciting. I am off of the internet. I think the Wi-Fi has cut out. But we have some things preloaded. At any rate, I actually thought that I was going to have to do this entire thing without the PowerPoint today, because I was teaching in Old Main at about 9:40. There goes the power. And that was fun. We finished the rest of the class, another 45 minutes. But yeah, I'm going to take a little look at the wireless. So a couple other interesting things about this. Composers are very influenced by this Gabrielli today. But if everybody was together and everybody's theory is wrong, why is it that some people go a little bit for a while and then other people go? That first started happening about 1560. Never before in music did we have that. There are two other explanations besides just the cathedral being an amazing spot for that. The first is that a composer named Josquin really popularized just having, it used to be that Renaissance was 4 parts all the time. Josquin would have duets for long periods of time, and then the tenors and basses would sing, sopranos and altos would go for a while. And suddenly, they thought this is a good idea. Why don't we make it 4 and 4 go for a while, and then 4 go for a while. And that sounds cool. That sounds very neat. And it's such a nice effect when everything is back together. The second thing is that Venice was trying to compete with the rest of the world. They were trying to make things grander and grander. So they thought their instrumental sizes were increasing larger and larger. They had 60 performers at certain times, which is just crazy for that time. And so they thought, well, if we have 60 people, we can just write 20 things and have 3 per part, which is way more resource than anybody else had at that time. So those are alternatives to why it might not be separated galleries. We may have to come back to that a little bit.
You are connected, at least it was for a minute.
Ah, here we go. Okay, good. Very good. Yeah, here we go. Get Barack Obama out of there, maybe.
Mehrchöriges Musizieren hat seinen Ausgang in Italien genommen. Schon im 16. Jahrhundert hat man damit experimentiert.
So those are in separate galleries. This church is way smaller than St. Mark's. These can actually, you should be able to see right around here. That's how close they are. Now let's listen to it one more time. Do they ever play at the same time together? You can see that ones on the right are not playing. And now they are, but it's alternated. That way they're able to stay together. So there's an argument for that piece is totally fine in separate choirs. Okay, great. Close you. So there's that left a lasting influence. Gabriele, if you say Gabriele, everybody who's went to the basic music history says, ah yes, he is the guy with the choirs and the galleries. Things like that. So let's look how he influenced later people. After the Venetian style, people started saying, wow, we can actually put people in various places. A fellow named Heinrich Schütz started writing in directions. He was a pupil of Gabriele's. And he said, maybe for the first time in a preface ever that we know of, he said, you should put this choir here, and this choir here, and this choir here, and that'll be a really interesting effect. This was a 1636 piece. Prior to that, it would just been, they're going to perform where they're going to perform. But in Schütz, he wrote that, and he said, I don't really care. You could hire as many people as you want and just put a lot of them around the church. What's interesting is that people ignore that direction a lot of times when they perform this piece. It's called the Musikalische Exequien. When they perform that piece these days, they usually just have one choir. But Schütz in his preface says, please make as many copies as you feel is wise, and place them around the church. So now we're starting to see performance directions. So let's go to a very, very famous piece that has performance directions that people are not necessarily following these days. Handel. Handel Messiah is the #1 piece. I've had to sing it approximately 15 times already. Yeah, I mean in 15 different performances, often 3 times per performance. It's very popular. It's been popular since it was written in 1741. There's one note, da lontano, in the distance, far away. The first entrance of the trumpets comes in when the angels appear in the Messiah. As you see, most performances just ignore this note. And they say, well, you know, it's an orchestra and a choir. That means the trumpets sit right there. Trumpets always sit right there, right in front of the choir, right in the back of the orchestra. And it's just kind of a pain to move them around. Well, it's very cool if the trumpets are in the distance, because the text is, and suddenly an angel appeared and said to another. So this is sort of a character effect of, you've seen these people who have been performing all along, and suddenly an angel appeared. And often it's the case that the trumpets are away of sight. It's off stage. You can't see them. You just hear these trumpets doing this, and it has a great effect with the text. Let's listen to a little bit of this. Hopefully Mountain Dew won't hear. Okay. So what if those trumpets that you kind of hear there, right now, they don't mean much at all. But it's the first time they play in the whole piece. This is movement 17 of the piece. You've been sitting there a while, and you're not hearing any trumpets. And the trumpet players could have nipped off to the restaurant and had a pop, we'll say. Then they come back, and they're playing this. So it's a really special moment. But is it possible to tell that from this little bit. Just a nice little color, but it's not da lontano, and it is not reflecting the fact that this is the first appearance of the trumpets at the moment that the angels appear. It's a missed opportunity in my book, and I actually went through every YouTube video I could try to find, and I saw none where the trumpets were da lontano. I've been part of performances where they do it, and it's really rather wonderful. The trumpets always complain because then they have to walk way around the audience backstage and then come back to their spots in time for the Hallelujah chorus and a couple other things they play for. But it's I think a missed opportunity. So there are many, many pieces of performance directions that I could be telling you about. My point is more to suggest various uses so we can talk about what it means to have spatial directions and things like that. Hector Berlioz wrote a Requiem, which is a huge piece. He said it would be good to have 600 to 800 singers for this piece. But if you have to, minimum 80 sopranos. Maybe you could get away with 70 altos, 60 tenors, and 70 basses. But preferably 800 singers. However, if you have 800 singers, please only use 400 for the quieter moments. I brought this score with me today, but I left it in my office, unfortunately. I can show you. It also calls for a lot of orchestral players. Now in the Requiem, there's the text, the Dies Irae, Day of Judgment, Day of Wrath. And so in Revelation in the Bible, where this is taken from, there's talking about the four corners of the earth, north, east, west, and south. And Berlioz says, I can do something with that. In a similarly massive array of performing forces, he has brass groups, these, like a dozen players, put in that corner, that corner, that corner, and that corner. And he says, please put them around, equidistant from each other, encircling the audience, making it feel as if the day of wrath has come from every direction. It's a really amazing moment. I found, I'm happy to say that this is followed more often than the Handel. And there are a lot of performances still where people don't really move the brass groups. Maybe they'll put them at the outsides of the orchestra and they kind of follow it. But that's not the same. The audience has to be encircled. And suddenly you are surrounded by this day of wrath. And the marking is fortissimo, as loud as possible, basically. And it's really interesting. And it starts from one direction and kind of spreads around. It's a surround sound. Lights come on. They're all in the galleries up there. I don't know if you can see. again, part of the problem with talking about this is that we can't experience it ourselves. If I'm just talking about it here and playing a recording, we've got these guys. That's all I can use. To actually experience it is beyond description, which is what a lot of great art really is in some ways. So the brass here is absolutely critical in order to get that feeling. And I don't know if you could see it, it's a little harder to see on the screen than it is on the projector than it is on my screen, but did you see how they're being coordinated? This is a 21st century solution. There is a webcam on the conductor, and every group in its own gallery has its own TV, and they watch the conductor going like this. And it's way more together than it ever could have been in some ways, because otherwise you're kind of squinting like 400 feet away to see what the conductor is doing. And it's still not quite together, which is interesting. You may have to know the score to know that, but it's together enough to have the right effect. So they're trying to solve that problem. This Day of Judgment, the choir has been singing for a long time until then. Suddenly the choir just completely cuts out that whole length, and then you see at the end they come back in. But if it were just the trumpets sitting up on stage, you were watching the trumpets play, and the rest of the brass. Okay, this is going on a little bit long. Even then, we could pick up a little bit of that feeling just from watching this recording. But if it's surround sound, this is what we can't capture. It sounded like just a block sound, but it's coming from there, and then there, and then there, and then they're all together, and then it's just that group, and then it flows around a little bit. It's a wonderful, it's pre-Bose type of deal. So again, this makes the piece. This plus the absurd number of people, this is literally the Symphony of 1,000. Because you literally could have 1,000 performers in this thing. It makes the piece. Okay, next up, I'm going to skip a lot of other examples and go right to a different sort of person. So you may be wondering, if this is so effective in these certain cases, why didn't people use it all the time? It can get a little bit, it can seem trite, or it can be annoying if someone is just randomly moving somebody out there. Like, why are you not with the rest of the orchestra? Unless it's for, if it's for, not such good effect. There came along a fellow who said, I'm going to use it in every one of my pieces. And his name is Henry Brent. Worked in America all his life. Only wrote spatial music, classically. He made a living just by composing for films and radio shows. I mean, he has so much music out there that he just didn't really care about. He just wrote it to make a living, and he was very good at it. And it's also often interesting with composers like that, that you consider that they maybe are frustrated by the simplicity of what they have to write. And so his brain is spinning as he's writing that little jingle or something like that. What can I be doing that's really artistic? And he decided his life's mission was going to be spatial music. Even today, if you showed the title of my presentation to many musicologists, they would say, Henry Brent? Is that who you're going to talk about? Because he's associated with this concept more than anybody else. He popularized it to some extent. He pioneered it. What he did is, that is the most interesting, besides just saying I'm going to do this for everything, is that he serialized space. Now, in order to explain that, I'll have to dig a little deeper. The serialization of music in general happened in the 20th century. You may be familiar with the fellow Arnold Schoenberg. He, in what music, is atonal music. It sounds very dissonant. Atonal means there's no tonal center. It is serialized, in that it is random. Or rather, it is ordered according to a method that will not have any center and then he applies mathematical functions to that. Then another fellow later serialized rhythm, so you might have to dun, 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 trying to get any order out of it. This was the aesthetic they were hoping to get in the mid-1930s, late 1920s, and things like that. Henry Brant saw this going on in the 1930s and said, I can serialize space. So I could have, let's try to avoid any focal point. I'm going to have a guy on the stage there, and there should be no place that seems, if you asked someone, if you had 5 people to point to the main spot on stage where people were performing, they should all point to different spots. That was his goal on some of the pieces. And he was the first one to think about things like this. Very, very interesting that he decided to do that. He had a few spatial principles about his music, whether serialized or not. All of his pieces needed to have at least 2 ensemble groups that were distinct not only in placement but also in style. So you can, it's almost like hearing, you know, a band playing a march over there, and then there's like a string quartet going on with Haydn. That would fit that. Retains the scheme consistently throughout. Doesn't take on any other characters. It's basically a character in an opera that does its own thing, but doesn't interact with the other characters. They're both in their own bedrooms or something like that. Second principle, they should be dispersed to specific locations and not merely upon the stage. Just using the stage is a huge waste of an opportunity. Preferably widely separated from each other so you can clearly perceive the different characters between the different groups. His plans are not optional, nor are they small distanced. In other words, you need to do this and go big. The distance must be the maximum possible. The third principle, they can, if natural sounding complexity is desirable by the composer, they can perform in, quote, non-coordinated rhythm. In other words, if he wants a certain effect, he can so arrange it that they both happen to be hitting a complex rhythm at the same time. And that creates some problems because you have this one group with its, usually these groups will have 2 different conductors, one for each group, and now the conductors have to try to match up at the same time. They're doing completely different things. So they don't usually even have the other group score in front of them. So they just have to kind of know when they're going to line up. But he does that just to get an interesting aural effect. So let's take a look at a sample piece of Brant. This would be in the score, not just sheet music, but this is sheet music of space. This is only about half of it. I can only fit half on the slide. It goes up from there. This is in New Haven's Wolsey Hall. It was premiered there at Yale. There's some really nuts things in here. The tuba is under the vents in the floor. It's in the basement. Having been, Wolsey Hall is where I did all my graduate work at Yale. And you can hear people, if they're playing in the basement, you're wondering, where is that coming from? In fact, a small part of the organ, which is the 10th largest organ in the world, exists in the basement only. And it comes up through the grates. And Henry Brant knew this, and he carefully placed everybody here. Some of these placements are difficult because they're sort of in the middle where people would be sitting. Didn't matter to him, he just broke it off. We don't have a video of this first performance, and it's hard for me to convey to you, but you can kind of get the sense. You see there's viola-cello conductor, conducts the one group, then there's the violin conductor in the upper left. The main conductor is on the floor, this sort of circle is. Just do what I wanted to. You see where it is. That's interesting. I'm going to talk about, and we'll listen to one of Brant's pieces called Orbits. not like the flight booking website. This piece is on YouTube, 2009 performance of it, conducted by a man named Neely Bruce. After I had started my studies of spatial music, I fortunately obtained an appointment at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, a very good private school, and I directed the orchestra there. Neely Bruce is the chair of the composition department, and he happened to be the curator of Henry Brandt's papers. I said, oh, this is very convenient. One of those nice life things. And Neely was very good friends with Henry Brandt. And he said that Brandt was utterly obsessed with performing spaces. As soon as he entered a concert hall or something, he would just look around, okay, yep, can perform there. It's like someone seeing a score for the first time. And they say, oh yeah, interesting. But Brandt would just like walk around everywhere. We'll look at a little bit of Orbits, which is performed at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, conducted by Neely Bruce. And as you're watching this, just kind of take a note. Anytime you've seen a recent piece in the past 50 years, or when you will see a piece written that recently, realize that it's Henry Brandt's influence that caused, if you see someone put off to the side or something like that, if there's any spatial direction, Henry Brandt is the guy who made that popular, more or less. Here's a bit of Orbits. If this fails, we can go to orbits.com probably. It's a soprano. That they're trying to follow. I apologize for the video quality. It's a little shaky actually on this particular laptop, but yeah, it's very interesting. And again, we can get maybe 5% of the experience of this from this one video. So it's happening all around. Now, why is Brandt not famous? Because the music is not compelling to most of the public. It's atonal. It's strange. And the point of it is to be very spatial. If you'll permit me a little joke, it was his spatiality. But the music is not very compelling, unfortunately, for most people. If you hear that, do you want to hear more of it? Most people answer, I'll listen to something else. Which is too bad for Henry Brandt that he wasn't, working with a different idiom, that he could have done something else. But speaking of somebody who is rather dissonant, Karlheinz Stockhausen pushed boundaries of music in all kinds of ways, infamous for being dissonant all the time. If Henry Brandt sounded fairly dissonant, Stockhausen really goes for it. Stockhausen is a much more famous composer. He wrote a lot, and he was very well known. And composition students have to study him, generally speaking. He wrote a piece called Gruppen, which just means groups in German, in 1955, which is not long after Brandt started publishing all of his spatial music. But because Stockhausen is so much more famous, this is thought to be the first real spatial piece. It's not, as we have seen. Henry Brandt created everything. But what I want to talk about is the incredible piece, the Helicopter Quartet. This is a really interesting use of spatial music. It's also extremely expensive to put on. without further ado, I'm going to play you a little bit of the Helicopter Quartet. Goes on. This piece has been performed many times. As I said, very expensive, but it's very striking and people like doing it because it generates a huge amount of publicity. It's amusing to see, however, the number of likes versus dislikes on this video. 2,700 to 1,700. But it's been viewed almost 1 million times. It's approaching 1 million views. Because it's so strange. We gape at the debacle of why someone would spend so much money on it. Because the art is not in the music, it's in the helicopters. The music is fine. There are many pieces like that out there, but it's famous because of the helicopters. It's very, very interesting.
Question? Is there choreography on the helicopters, or are they flying as they...
The helicopters are not, they are given instructions about how to fly, but they don't have the same kind of score that the string players do. They don't have the directions to go and things like that.
What about, it almost reminds me of dance.
Yeah, I think that would be an appropriate thing. It's improvise as in dance, something like that. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, how would that piece be received? Like,
The audience is usually on the ground,
okay.
and there are speakers.
Okay, so there's monitors for relaying inside of the helicopter.
Yeah, they have headphones, which are the monitors.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Again, a piece that requires a certain space, in fact, outside, and helicopters. So, these are some various kinds of pieces, and there are countless more pieces to consider. So, where my research is coming in, I've looked at all these pieces, and what I'm trying to establish now, and I've struck out in a few different directions, what is our theoretical framework for the use of space in music? How can we say the equivalent of this melody goes up to this note, which is the 5th scale degree, and then the most important note is the high note on the 6th scale degree, and it ends there. And performance practice says you should go to the high note and be the loudest there, and then come away, because it's near the end of the phrase, something like that. What can we do to establish a theoretical framework for use of space in any piece of music? It forms a key component of the experience, as we've talked about, even in pieces that are not overtly spatial. And if you misuse the space, if you do a string quartet, and you put them way in the corner of the stage, everybody thinks that's going to be a little strange. So what is going on there, and how can you take advantage of that? In the corollary, there's a recommendation, in the same way that theory helps performers. How can we find the best use of this space? How can we use our theoretical framework and then make recommendations for what most people enjoy when it comes to high artistry? Their common uses of space basically fall into 2 categories. The concert, in which everybody sits in a nice seat, and you're all facing the stage, and maybe the seats are angled a little bit toward the center of the stage, and the performers stand in the center of the stage. The conductor usually has to go there, or maybe it's the soloist. But either way, it's supposed to be symmetrical, pleasing aesthetically to the eye. That's a common performance. The other major type is a liturgy, where the focus is not on the music as its own end, but rather on something else like worship, primarily. The music is all part of the experience. There may be, you might see something, you might smell something if there's incense. Part of that. Screens is part of a concert, but this is an increasingly popular thing, and it's almost a third category for me. You're sitting at a concert that is so large that you're far away from the performance. There may be as far away as that building, and you have screens mounted near you that have really up-close shots of the performance. I've watched people at such concerts, and they watch the screens. Almost everybody says, I want to be able to see the screen. So that's an interesting thing. You're at a live concert, and you're not necessarily watching. You could be watching the same thing anywhere. Your ears are hearing an amplified sound. So now we're starting to blur the boundaries of, but it is still of a central stage. Where is the stage in that case? I mean, you're in the same spot as everybody, so you want the communal experience. I want to talk a little bit about some interesting aspects of ways to combine space and art. An opera is usually taking place in, for instance, the Michigan Opera Theater. I've been working with I'm the chorus master for Opera Modo, which is a new opera project, maybe about a year and a half ago, founded, and is started for absolutely nothing, and they just got a $20,000 matching grant, actually, so it could be up to $40,000. And the performances are in interesting local venues. You can see JMPND, Detroit Historical Museum, Carr Center. So here's a little bit of a performance we just did at the Carr Center. This is an art gallery we've converted. So it's very hard. It's very hard to see in some ways, but it's an art gallery, and that focuses your sensation of the space a little bit. This is unusual, your mind tells you. I'm listening to an opera in an art gallery, and there's all kinds of fusion of things. And I wish I could unpack that a little bit more, but I realize I'm going a little bit on time. So the framework, my goal is to construct a framework that would be a useful tool for musicians. Whenever any musician is planning a performance, they think about where they're going to perform it. Sometimes they know. Often they say, oh, well, it has to be here. But the space, I say, is sort of like an additional performer. You kind of hire your space, if you think about it that way. I'm going to hire my cellist, I'm going to hire my alto, and I need to hire the right space that I want. In a way, it's worth the cost because it will enhance the experience that much more. Trying to find this framework has drawn me in so many different directions. I've needed to consult fellow colleagues in architecture for their ideas about how the best spaces should be designed. Acoustics, obviously, for space, acousticians have to contribute to the best sound for the best performances. Visual art, places like the Carr Center can really enhance it, or ornate cathedrals, things like that. Theater and dance are both extremely concerned with staging, and they're perhaps the experts about what it means if someone is off to the side on the stage and they're not in the center. They understand that there are treatises about things like that, and opera is in that category also. Psychology comes into the picture because of things like, what do people like? Why do they prefer pop music on the radio sometimes to a live performance? Why do they prefer to listen to music in this spot, etc.? There are frameworks in psychology that are more appropriate to address that. In sociology, for instance, why is it that people want to go to a live concert and the speakers are here and the screen is there and they don't look at the band? Because they're there with other people. Why is it people want to go to a concert that's very well attended? Because they can feed off the energy of other people. And how does that affect the experience of the space? And I'm intrigued by all these possibilities. I think I will leave you with those questions about where to go forward. And I invite your questions about what to do next.
Professor Horn did mention his connection to Yale, so I forgot in my introduction to